There is a tree that Japan tried to forget it ever worshipped. Not because it withered, not because it failed, but because it refused to be owned. For centuries, before it was reduced to a garden ornament sold in plastic pots at suburban nurseries, this tree was something else entirely, a living calendar, a spiritual instrument, a marker of death and rebirth that no empire, no shogunate, no modern institution could ever fully contain. Today the West knows it simply as the Japanese maple. The people who first understood it called it something closer to fire that does not burn. This is the story of what was buried beneath its roots. Welcome back to Ancient Food Files. This channel exists to preserve what modern life has quietly discarded, knowledge systems that predate convenience, that predate ownership, that predate the idea that nature must serve a purpose to be allowed to exist. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description. That way, you can verify it yourself. If that matters to you, consider staying, not for growth, not for algorithms, simply so that what we uncover here does not disappear again into silence. Subscribing is not a favor to us, it is an act of preservation. Now, let us open the archive. Long before Kyoto had temples, before Japan had a written language of its own, the mountains of Honshu were home to a tree whose leaves turned the color of dried blood every autumn, without explanation, without pattern that the untrained eye could predict. The Ainu people, who lived across the northern islands long before the Yamato court consolidated power, held oral traditions describing certain trees as boundary markers between the world of the living and the world of ancestors. Palmate leafed trees, trees whose foliage split into 5 or 7 points like an open hand, were treated with particular caution, a hand reaching, but never grasping. Further south, in the mountain villages that would later become part of Kyoto Prefecture, a ritual called Momijigari emerged, literally, hunting for autumn leaves. But this was not hunting in the sense of pursuit for consumption. It was pilgrimage. Families would walk for days into remote valleys not merely to observe color, but to sit beneath these trees in silence, believing the falling leaves carried messages from those who had died that year. The tree at the center of this ritual, what botanists would eventually classify and export to the world as the Japanese maple, grew low and wide, rarely taller than 10 meters, with bark smooth enough to seem unnatural, almost deliberate. Its leaves, palmate and deeply lobed, transformed each autumn through a chemical sequence the villagers could not name but could clearly observe, green giving way to gold, gold surrendering to a red so deep it appeared almost black in low light. They did not need a name for anthocyanin to understand that something profound was occurring beneath the bark. What the villagers witnessed by instinct, we can now describe in mechanism. As autumn temperatures drop and daylight shortens, the Japanese maple begins withdrawing chlorophyll from its leaves, a slow, deliberate act of internal economy. Chlorophyll, the pigment responsible for green, is expensive to produce. Rather than waste it, the tree reclaims and stores it, preparing to shed leaves it no longer needs to survive winter. But as the green fades, something else happens. Sugars trapped within the leaf, unable to fully transport back into the branches, begin reacting with proteins in the cell sap. This reaction produces anthocyanin, the same pigment family responsible for the color of blood oranges, red cabbage, dark grapes. The result is not decoration, it is chemical defense. Anthocyanin acts as a sunscreen for the leaf during its final vulnerable days, protecting the tree's remaining nutrient recovery process from UV damage as it prepares to let go entirely. In other words, this tree does not die loudly, it withdraws with precision, salvaging what it can, releasing only what it must, and closing itself for winter with a final act that happens to look, to human eyes, like fire. This is not beauty as accident, this is beauty as strategy. By the 9th century, Momijigari had become embedded in the aristocratic culture of the Heian court. Court poets composed verses specifically about these crimson trees, treating the changing leaves as a meditation on impermanence, a concept that would later crystallize into the broader Japanese philosophy of mono no aware, the pathos of things passing. Temples began deliberately cultivating groves of these trees near sacred grounds. Tofuku-ji, founded in the 13th century in Kyoto, planted entire valleys of the Japanese maple specifically so monks and pilgrims could walk beneath the canopy each November as an exercise in confronting mortality without fear. During periods of famine and civil war, particularly the Sengoku period, when Japan fractured into competing domains for over a century, mountain villages relied on these same trees for something more practical than spiritual reflection. The wood, dense and slow-growing, was prized for tool handles and small structural work when larger timber was requisitioned by warring lords. The tree's resilience in poor mountain soil, where rice could not grow and larger trees struggled, meant it often survived when cultivated crops failed entirely. It asked for almost nothing, and in exchange, it gave shelter, tool wood, and a reason to keep walking into the mountains even when there was little left to walk toward. And then, slowly, it stopped being sacred. As Japan modernized through the Meiji era and later industrialized in the 20th century, land that once held wild groves of the Japanese maple was cleared for agriculture, for railways, for the uniform efficiency that modern infrastructure demanded. A tree that grew slowly, that could not be harvested on a predictable industrial timeline, that refused to produce a marketable yield, had no place in a system built around output. It was not banned, it was not condemned, it was simply inconvenient, too slow for lumber, too wild for orchards, too spiritually loaded for a nation trying to present itself as modern and rational to the West. What survived did so mostly in temple gardens and aristocratic estates, curated and pruned into ornamental versions of what had once grown wild and unmanaged across entire mountainsides. By the time the Japanese maple was exported to European and American gardens in the 19th century, it arrived stripped of the ritual that once made it sacred, a decoration, admired for color alone. The wild groves were rarely deliberately destroyed, they were simply never protected, and what is not protected, in a century of expansion, eventually disappears by default. Modern research has begun returning, cautiously, to what the mountain villages already understood. Studies published through Kyoto University's forestry programs in recent decades have examined the Japanese maple's unusually efficient nutrient recycling process during autumn leaf senescence, noting that species capable of this level of internal resource conservation demonstrate significantly higher resilience during prolonged drought and poor soil conditions compared to faster-growing ornamental competitors. Separate ecological surveys of remaining wild groves in Nagano and Gifu prefectures have documented these trees functioning as keystone species in fragile mountain ecosystems, their root systems stabilizing thin mountain soil in ways that prevent erosion during the heavy rains that increasingly define the region's climate pattern. None of this was unknown to the people who once walked into these valleys each November. It was simply unmeasured. Science, in this case, did not discover anything new. It confirmed, with instruments, what oral tradition had already encoded in ritual. For a generation of post-war Japanese families rebuilding after 1945, the old mountain rituals faded further still. Momijigari became, for many, a tourist activity rather than a spiritual one, a weekend outing to Kyoto, a photograph, a crowded viewing platform. The deeper tradition, walking alone or in small family groups into wild, unmanaged groves to sit with grief, became difficult to sustain in a country rapidly urbanizing, where fewer families lived near the mountains their ancestors once walked. The ritual did not die from rejection, it died from distance, from generations moving to cities faster than the knowledge of why could be transmitted. What remains today, in gardens across the world that grow the Japanese maple purely for ornament, is often the aesthetic without the meaning, the color without the ritual it once carried. We are entering a period defined by soil collapse, unpredictable growing seasons, and ecosystems under stress from decades of monoculture and short-term extraction. Species that were dismissed for being slow, unmanageable, or commercially inconvenient are, increasingly, the species best equipped to survive what is coming. The Japanese maple, a tree that spent centuries perfecting the art of retreat, of salvaging what it can before winter, of surviving in soil too poor for anything else, of enduring where faster, more demanding species could not, is not a relic, it is a blueprint. It was never waiting to be discovered, it was waiting for conditions to once again resemble the ones it was built for. The knowledge was never lost. It was only set down, generation by generation, by people who no longer had the time, the land, or the need to carry it forward. Somewhere in the mountains of Honshu, wild groves of the Japanese maple still turn crimson every November, unwitnessed by anyone walking with the old intention. The trees do not require an audience. They never did. They simply continue, withdrawing, conserving, releasing, enduring, on a timeline that owes nothing to human urgency. Nature does not ask for permission to persist. It only asks for patience. If this story mattered to you, consider staying with ancient food files, not for growth, for preservation. What we uncover here only survives if someone chooses to remember it.